Director of Law and Activities. Yes, so this is an event that you can earn points towards your PLHS membership.
So you know, I'll do like file for Delta and all that stuff at some point, and then I went to like their main one, they kept saying the exact same stuff with the background safety.
I hate PLHS. The only reason why I do it is membership position. I literally hate this one. And, you know, everyone's here, so don't tell anybody. But it's very poorly run. I think it would have to have better.
You should have been president.
I don't put popularity contests there.
Welcome. I'm Gail Sasnett, Assistant Director of the Bob Graham Center, in charge of the public programming here. Thank you so much for being here. What a great audience we have tonight. We're very happy tonight to have the two journalists who wrote the investigative series, Bias on the Bench. Interviewing them will be Professor Sandra Chance, the McClatchy Professor in Freedom and Information and former Director of the Bretner Center from the College of Journalism. After the talk, there will be time for Q&A. We ask you to come to the microphone, which will be set up here in the middle aisle. We're streaming and recording, and your question will not be picked up unless you do come and speak right into the microphone. So if I remind you, that's why I'm reminding you. Please turn off your cell phones now. And Professor Chance is going to introduce our reporters and begin. Thank you.
Good evening, and let me add my welcome to my MMC 4200 students who are here, members of the community, members, I hope, of the local bar. I see some judges here as well, so we're excited to have you all here. The format for this evening will be a question and answer session for about 40 minutes, and then we'll leave 20 minutes at the end for you all to ask questions. So let's get started. We have two reporters here from the Sarasota Herald-Tribune who worked for a year on the series that is titled Bias on the Bench. This is an award-winning, nominated and award-winning series, and it focuses on racial inequality in Florida's sentencing system. The first week it was published in December of last year. It got 250,000 hits on the internet and 1 million requests. Quite a lot of interest in this area, to say the least. It's been recognized, as I said, most recently nominated for an American Society of News Editors that medal, which is one of the biggest honors you can have in journalism. I'd like to introduce you briefly to our two reporters. I'm going to start on my far left with Emily Lacaze. Emily has 20 years of reporting experience. She spent time in Mississippi before joining the Sarasota Herald-Tribune. She is the Deputy Investigation Editor and graduated from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Our other guest tonight is Josh Salman. He's actually a native of Sarasota, and I don't know why, but he wound up at the University of North Florida rather than the University of Florida, and was managing editor of the student newspaper in North Florida. He worked at a number of newspapers around the state before joining the Herald-Tribune. He was just named the Society of Professional Journalists 2016 Journalist of the Year, so quite an honor as well. Matthew Sauer, the interim executive editor of the Sarasota Herald-Tribune, when I talked to him and asked him to tell me a little bit about Emily and Josh, he said that Emily came to the project late, not late, but what did he say? Fairly late in the process. But she was the perfect partner for Josh because, and she made quite an impact. He described Josh as hard-charging and aggressive, and Emily he describes as more thoughtful and measured, always questioning assumptions and pushing for verification. That sounds like a great team to me. We're going to explore that a little bit. So I want to just take a few minutes to get to know you and talk to you about your interest in journalism, and then we'll get to the nuts and bolts of the scene. So, and you can choose who goes when. The first question is, how did you get interested in journalism?
Sure, is my mic? Yeah, it is. So I got interested in journalism fairly early. When I was a little girl, I actually wrote a neighborhood newspaper that my dad I wrote it on his typewriter that we had in our basement, and we'd draw the comics and write the news of the neighborhood, and who got grounded for what, and and then I would give it to my dad, and he would run off copies at his office on his copy machine, and then I would go and sell them to the neighbors for 25 cents. And I still have copies of some of them. They're pretty ridiculous. And then in high school, my friends and I had an underground newspaper, so it wasn't the approved school newspaper. We wanted to be a little more radical, and so we had our own that nobody knew it was us, and we would cover what we thought were really important stories until we got caught. Our days of underground journalism were over. And then in college, I was drawn to it again. I mean, it was just a natural, this was something that I guess I was interested in. So I pursued it professionally, and I love it.
All right, so for me it started in high school as well, when I actually learned that I could avoid taking English by enrolling in a journalism class. So that sounded fantastic to me, and it was. So just the people and the stories and the buzz of journalism sort of had me hooked immediately, and when I got to college, that really ramped up. So stumbled into it with a little bit of high school laziness, but it turned out to be the perfect career for me, and never sort of looked back, I guess.
You met with students an hour for a little while. I don't think it was an hour, but you met with students before the session. And thank you for doing that. What was the best question you got from the students?
Gosh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Well, somebody asked what the reaction of the judges was, and I thought that was a good question just because it showed interest beyond just our reporting, but more the reaction and what happens in the community afterward, which I think is always, you want to think of beyond your reporting and what happens afterward. And so I thought that was a good question.
Yeah, absolutely. And someone even asked, if we would make the data available and sort of what could be done with the data, beyond this in terms of reaching out to other universities, other students, other journalists? And I thought that was a good question in terms of sort of taking next steps with the data and the information that we sort of laid the groundwork for.
So how did you get partnered?
Well, we're both on the investigations team together. We're not a huge newspaper, you know, we're still a community newspaper in a smaller newsroom, but we are fortunate enough to still have an investigations team. When we started the project, there were 4 members of the team, including the editor, and it started with 3 of us. I believe Emily was finishing up another project, and then when we realized the size, the ambition, and the scope of this, you know, we realized we would need Emily's expertise to finish it off. So she joined in, pretty quickly and hit the ground rolling, and that's how we got working on it. But we are in the investigations team together, so we do work on these sort of long-term projects. So that just kind of fell into our area of the newsroom.
So you spent a year looking at the issue. You, let's see, you reviewed tens of millions of records. You examined more than 85,000 criminal appeals. You read through boxes and boxes of court documents. You crossed the state to interview more than 100 legal experts, advocates, and criminal defendants. You used 2 databases, and you also built your own database. And so I would like you to tell us a synopsis of what you found. And, you know, we're going to get into the nuts and bolts in a little bit, but sort of an overview of what you found.
Sure. I mean, a brief synopsis would be that we found that for the same crimes committed in the same communities by defendants with similar criminal histories, that in general, African American defendants receive longer sentences than white defendants. That's the synopsis. And to be honest, you know, being an American in this society, that, you know, that there is racism. It's inherent, and so we figured going into it that we might find just that. We didn't realize the extent of it, and we certainly had never seen the actual numbers before, so it was still very fascinating for us to be able to look at the data and measure it, and I guess confirm our assumptions.
Did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, that really sums it up.
So the war on drug has an impact on what you found as well?
Yeah, absolutely. When you look at, so we looked at several different individual crimes, and then we looked at broad classes, like for all first degree, all second degree, all third degree felonies. But across the board, felony drug crimes were the ones that seemed to drive the sentence disparity the widest, and that was regardless of the community. That seemed to be the case in county across, you know, county after county across the state, circuit after circuit across the state. Felony drug crimes is where you see the largest discrepancy between how African American defendants are sentenced versus white defendants.
And you also found a lack of diversity in the state court system?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, what we were able to do is we sort of looked at the roster of judges across Florida, and we were able to analyze sentencing records of every judge, and we were able to look at those and see how it measures between judges. You know, is it an African American judge? Is it a white judge? How do they treat African Americans and whites in their courtroom? That sort of thing. Also, judges in Florida are nonpartisan, but you know, in reality, they are people. They vote. You know, they have political affiliations. They have, you know, political leanings. So what we did was we actually checked their voter registrations in every single Florida county for every sitting judge we could find, and we were able to also track sentencing patterns based on the judges' politics. So that was pretty interesting as well. But when we looked at everything, we did see on the bench in Florida, only about 6% of sitting judges right now are African American, and few of them preside over serious felonies. The vast majority are in the lower county court level. So when you look at that, that number is greatly underrepresented of the population of African Americans in Florida, the population population of African Americans in Florida's correctional systems and the population of African Americans that are entering courtrooms. So disproportionate on the bench. And when we talked to legal experts, judges, others in the field, they stress the importance of more diversity on the bench and how that could go a long way to help addressing some of the issues that we've uncovered.
So it sounds like there are a lot of factors that go into the criminal system and the sentencing decision. What led you to focus on the judge's part of that?
Sure. Well, the judges are the ones who have ultimate responsibility for sentencing defendants. That's in the state law, that's their statutory responsibility, and their name is on the sentencing order. So ultimately, in a story about sentence disparity, we want to look at who is giving out the sentence, and it's the judges. And so they, I feel like I'm probably answering another question down the road for you, but one of the biggest pushbacks that we got from the story has been from judges who say, you can't blame me for racial disparity that's that's inherent throughout the criminal justice system, that indeed is inherent throughout society. I feel like whenever I turn my head, I lose the mic, so I'm sorry, I'm only looking this way. I see you guys, though. And I get that. Maybe that's why I'm the thoughtful one. I really thought really deeply about this, and I get that. But at the end of the day, what we're looking at is sentencing, and the judge has ultimate discretion, even when it's a plea deal. And that was one of their main arguments. Look, the bulk of the cases that come before us are the result of plea deals. We didn't give out these sentences. They were brought to us. They were negotiated between the defendant and the prosecutor. In fact, Judge Lee Hayworth of Sarasota said, the defendants are asking us for these sentences. We're just saying okay to them. But they still have responsibility for those sentences too, and they don't have to accept them. And so what we decided at the end of the day was to focus on the judges, because ultimately they are in control of their courtroom and they are in control of those sentences. And if we're really looking past just the stories and we're looking at what do we want to accomplish from our writing, well, we want to change the sentence disparity. We would like to see it even up. We don't need to wait for the legislature to pass a law. The people who have responsibility, who have the power right now to change those sentences are the judges, and they can do this. And so we feel like that they're the ones that we're writing to and the ones that we're writing about. And that's why we made that decision.
Can I add to that just a little bit? Yeah, so absolutely, everything Emily said is absolutely true. Just to sort of add to that, so again, the big argument was the idea that upwards of 90% of cases in some circuits are resolved by plea deals that are often negotiated before they reach the judge's desk. However, the way the plea process works in Florida, the vast majority of these pleas are recommendations. The judges are not bound by those recommendations. They can alter them, and in many circuits they do. In some circuits they do not alter them at all. But it is up to the judge, and they have discretion to make changes if they believe the plea is not inherently fair. Also, we've talked to lawyers on both sides, both defense and prosecutors, and they say yes, while it's true that a lot of these cases are sorted out through the plea process, they understand the characteristics and qualities of a particular judge. Some judges are more lenient than others, and they will tailor their deals to what a judge expects. And as a result, that's why you see judges who in the same circuit, they're working with the same prosecutors and the same defense lawyers of other judges in the same circuit. And that's why you'll see these judges have greatly different sentencing disparities when they're just down the hall. So, you see on a lot of ends how the judge still will dictate the sentence, or, the judge's attitude in the court will be reflected in those sentences. Also, what we've done is we actually, and this was part of a follow-up that we just published a few days ago, is we sort of taking that argument into account, and we went back and redid our analysis, and we did it with the thought of, okay, well, judges say they should only be measured by that 10%. Judges argue they should only be measured by the trial cases. So what happens if we go through and look at just those trial cases? And that's exactly what we did. And what we saw was the sentencing disparity between African Americans and whites actually grows. And it grows significantly in those trial cases. So actually, when pleas are introduced, it becomes a fairer process. So again, that shows that absolutely there's accountability at the judge level. And as the public defender in Broward County put it, the idea that judges play little to no role in these sentences, he called it laughable. So that just gives you an idea there are those who are living in the system, working it every day, and they also adamantly disagree with that argument.
Oh, and one final note, we did talk to several experts who have done these types of analyses before, all of whom told us we should include plea deals in our sentence analysis. So we did reach out to experts and follow their recommendations.
Correct. The U.S. Sentencing Commission, Yale Law Journals, and University of British Columbia, Penn State, all the major research that had been done on an academic level also includes plea deals when evaluating judges and sentencing data.
So as simply as you can explain it to us, will you tell us, sort of how the sentencing guidelines work and how you factored in all of the different mitigating circumstances and aggravating circumstances, and then, sort of that big overview of your findings?
Sure. So we used two different databases. The first one we used was the offender-based transaction system, which is a massive sort of living database that's maintained by the Office of the State Court Administrator. And it's court clerks from all across the state input information about every criminal case in Florida. And so as that case evolves, new information is entered. If a defendant switches from a public defender to a private attorney, that new information is entered. If their charge is dropped or a new charge is added, that information is entered. And there were like 82 million records that we collected from that database. And we paid like $15,000 for it. And it took us months to sort of wrangle it because it's massive and it has 114 fields. Each field is coded differently, so we had to sort of figure out what the codes meant. But basically, we were able to, there are fields in that database that allowed us to remove defendants who had violated parole, for example, which means their sentence might be more severe because of that violation of parole. We were able to remove violent offenders, I think repeat offenders, habitual offenders, people who committed a crime that would have mandated stiffer sentences, like if they wore a mask or had a deadly weapon or were within 500 feet of a church or something. All those things we eliminated to avoid those defendants skewing the averages so that we would really try to have like crimes. But there was a weakness in that database, and that was you really couldn't get a sense of each defendant's history. So we didn't have the ability when we're looking at 13 years worth of data from all over the state, every criminal case. We obviously couldn't pull everybody's file and look at them to see how similar the defendants were. So that was a weakness in that database that we were actually able to overcome by getting the Department of Corrections database, which had a lot of this similar data. It was a much cleaner database, thankfully. But they also included the sentence score sheet that each defendant got right before they were sentenced. So basically in Florida, when you're sentenced for a crime, they do the score sheet where it takes into account not only the severity of the crime for which you're being sentenced, but also your past criminal history, other things like, were you carrying a gun or a mask, or victim injury, things like that. And then at the end, they come up with a score. And that score indicates basically your minimum sentence. This is the absolute minimum that you should be sentenced based on the score you received from all of this. So we were able to look at defendants who were charged with the same crime with the same score and what their sentence was. And we ran that database, and that database backed up what we found in the OBTS database. So in fact, we actually ended up relying on the DOC database for the majority of our reporting because those scores were so helpful in allowing us to try to get apples to apples.
And what did you find?
Well, what we found is when two defendants in the same community and in the same courtroom go before the same judge for the same crime with the exact same score, in more than 60% of cases, the African American will get longer time than the white defendant. And in some areas and in some cases that we profiled, those differences can be pretty egregious. We're talking about differences like 2 years in community jail versus 26 years in state prison. I mean, you know, these differences are not insignificant.
How did you decide which cases you were going to focus on or highlight in terms of the focus of the story?
Well, what we did was we used the databases to identify sort of the trends, right? I mean, we saw different trends, like Emily mentioned, in terms of the war on drugs. It became clear that that was a story that needed to be told, the war on drugs and its effect on this problem. You know, and then also we looked at certain areas. I mean, it was clear that certain areas, you know, had wider disparities between races than others. So we knew we had to tell the stories of what was it about those areas that was driving these trends that was different from the rest of Florida. So really, you know, we had to get into these communities. We had to learn how the court systems worked there because there can be differences circuit from circuit, even within the same state. And we had to learn the judges and learn the cases, and that took time. We were able to identify the cases through the DOC database, and we were able to do research and pull out examples of, let's say we wanted to look at drugs in Sarasota. You know, we could run filters down and pull up all the drug cases and then, you know, do different searches by the points and see what happens and try to line up cases and measure what happens, you know, when cases are similar and score the same points.
How did you decide which defendants to focus on? Like, I'm going to talk about this one.
They're the ones with the widest disparities. So, you know, we were able to line up. The OBTS database didn't have defendants' names, but the DOC database did. So basically, we filtered. Just give me the drug cases in this county, which our data shows is the county with the worst disparity. So give me all the defendants who were sentenced in this county on this charge, and then we were able to line them up. And when we see, you know, oh, there's an African American defendant. Oh my gosh, he got 20 years, and here's a white defendant. He got 3 years. All right, let's pull that one out, and then we dig into it. You know, those cases we were able to do more deep dives and, you know, pull up their cases, pull up their histories, and really look at, you know, what happened.
One of the, so this was a 4-part series, and one of the, I think it was part 3, focused on Gainesville. Why Gainesville, and what did you find? What were your findings about what was happening in Gainesville?
Sure. Gainesville was one of the ones where we saw the biggest, one of the biggest disparities in sentencing for felony drugs. And we were trying to figure out why. And it occurred to us that perhaps it's the presence of the university here. Because there are so many, you know, the university is majority white, and so you do have far more white people of an age who are probably more likely to experiment with drugs than most other places in the state. And although those people might not have, they might have limited means, they do have family networks with access to resources. And maybe they're able to get off of charges more easily than African Americans who live on the east side of town. And so, you know, we really explored that. And for me, it was a fascinating analysis because I came in here thinking that, well, we're going to find white kids and black kids who smoke pot and got busted, and the white kid gets off, the black kid doesn't, and it's, you know, mean old criminal justice system. And what I found was the black kids who were being arrested had a lot of priors. And so it made sense that they were getting more severe sentences because they, you know, when you open their cases, it was really actually frustrating. I was getting mad at them, like, you're not proving my point, which was fascinating though because it required me to go deeper. And so what was happening? Well, it's almost like the judge's hands are tied in these cases because these guys have been popped 3, 4, 5 times. So you're not going to get the same break as you did the first time. And when you looked at the first time they got busted, they did get the break. And then they do it again and again. And these are, you know, again, aggregate level, you know, analyses. I obviously not saying this about every case, but in general, this is what was happening. And so you really had to look at why. So when we pulled, you know, all right, let's pull all the, police stops and arrests, and it turns out that police actually are pulling over more African Americans. Most of these drug busts occur as a result of a traffic stop. And so most of the traffic stops that resulted in drug busts were traffic stops of African Americans. And when you looked at the reasons they were being stopped, it wasn't for excessive speed or dangerous driving. It was a broken taillight, or the headlight was too dim, or some really insignificant thing. And so what was happening was these people were being arrested again and again. But unfortunately, when they were arrested, they were arrested because they also had pot in the car, and so that kind of started getting us down this road of, well, why are they being busted more? I guess why do they have it on them more? And it sort of comes down to this question of legitimacy that really didn't make it into the story, but basically the gist is, if you live in an impoverished area and you don't get the same job opportunities, you don't get the same community investments, you don't get the same level of education in your public school district, you lose this sense of trust in the system. And people don't follow laws because they're afraid of getting caught if they don't. People follow laws because they believe in the system that enforces those laws. And when you lose belief in that system, you don't care anymore about following the laws. And so, especially when you're looking at East Gainesville, we talked to a lot of people who told us we've absolutely lost faith in the system, and not just the criminal justice system, but society in general. What does it matter if we follow the rules? We're not going to get ahead anyway. So you know what? I'm going to smoke pot. I don't care.
So students, you found that students using drugs or caught with drugs on campus get treated significantly differently than people out in the community, particularly on the east side of Gainesville.
Correct. But in Gainesville, and again, I mean, the story is on sentencing discrepancies, and what we found here in Gainesville, it was a policing issue as much as it was a judicial issue. So that's why if you read story 3, it's actually more of a policing story. And in other parts of the state, it's more the judges or more the prosecutor. I mean, every aspect of the criminal justice system will contribute to the disparities, and in some communities, there are different aspects that are pushing those disparities more. And here we really saw a lot of disparities in the treatment by policing.
I want to quickly ask you about this idea of implicit bias and the Harvard test. And then I want to ask you about the reaction both from the community and from the judiciary.
Well, the implicit bias was a really interesting issue that we stumbled across. And actually a professor here, and I do forget her name, so I apologize. Okay. Is leading or helping to lead a project called Project Implicit, where other universities are partnered in that as well. And they have been studying the science of implicit bias for a long time. And essentially what it is we're all exposed to different, whether it be TVs, books, just kind of what you see on a subliminal level. We all develop these biases that we're not aware of through the lives we've lived. And essentially over time, as you see lineups and you see it, and it's all, if you're watching a movie and you see a lineup and it's all, black defendants and not white, those sort of things become ingrained into your belief system. And over time, whether it's advertent or not, some of those beliefs can come through with your actions. So, it's interesting. We actually took the implicit bias test ourselves.
I was going to ask.
And we're leading this series. I don't know how Emily did, but I didn't do so well. So, it's something that we all have. And that's something that we brought to their attention. They're doing a lot with policing now in implicit bias. And judges are required to take implicit bias training. But a lot of the experts we spoke to, said that's not enough. And they really attributed a lot of the disparities that we see to implicit bias. It's really rare in Florida's courts that you'll see a judge that's explicitly racist. That just doesn't happen. There was a case out of Jacksonville this year, where I think you could get pretty close to that. And I think the judge had a case go to the Judicial Qualifications Commission because he was overheard saying something like all blacks need to go back to Africa. But comments like that, that's not a comment you'll hear often in Florida's courtroom. But what we do see is implicit biases, and those implicit biases are compounding a problem that we found through the data.
Did you all write the headline, or was that, and what did you think of it?
What was the headline?
No, we did not write the headlines.
Bias on the bench?
Oh, just
Or
the, we kicked around numerous ideas. Did I say yours? Was it? I don't remember who. We probably had like 30 or 40 working titles, and I really don't recall whose that was.
All right, let's talk about the reaction. And I'm assuming that as you interviewed people all over the state, you heard some questions about, your basic assumptions and the reality of life on the bench and the idea of who gets to control what kinds of things. At any point, did you say, wait, maybe we should rethink this project, or we're going to really consider this and focus in more in depth?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's exactly what happened with the Day 3 story, the war on drugs in Gainesville. We went into that with one idea, and we found something completely different. That story wasn't supposed to take as long as it did, and it really took a long time and a lot of just a lot more work, because we weren't finding what we thought we would find, and it turned us in a different direction. And I think that story stopped being about judges, and it really was about different steps in the criminal justice system, sort of looking at how African Americans and whites start out, maybe getting arrested for the same crime, and then their paths diverge at every step of the criminal justice system through various things like whether they're arrested versus just given a notice to appear, whether they're given a bond or not, whether they can make that bond or not, whether they have a private attorney versus a public defender. And the paths diverge further and further. So it was more of a nuanced story than I think originally it was going to be. And so that certainly is an example of how we did slow down and alter course because of that. But we heard a lot of different things from a lot of different people, both during our reporting and afterward. And I don't know, maybe if we had a few more months, things would have been slightly different. It's hard to say, but I feel really good about the work that we did. And there's no single story I've ever done where everybody's been lockstep and supportive. You're going to have a multitude of reactions, and certainly we did with this one.
Yeah. At the end of the day, I mean, it's the judge's sentence. The buck stops with them, and they're the ones that can be held accountable by the public. They're the ones that could be voted out of office. They're the ones, where they're the referees of the justice system. And I think as Kenneth Nunn, who is a law professor here, who we worked a lot with, as he said recently, if they're just taking back and accepting deals, if they're just sitting back and taking deals that are not fair, the judges are not doing their jobs.
One of the, following the series, state lawmakers introduced legislation to provide more judicial oversight. What's the status of the legislation?
So, correct. There is a bill filed by Senator Audrey Gibson out of Jacksonville, and another in the House out of by Representative McGee in Miami. And essentially the bill would ask the state to somewhat, and I don't want to say replicate, but take similar efforts to the ones we made in terms of looking at the data themselves, analyzing it, and seeing, if the state finds similar patterns, and then they would take it to the next step on what they would do with that. But actually, it's been pretty interesting. So the largest opponents of that additional oversight have been judges, and have been judges in Sarasota in the 12th Circuit where we are. And they actually worked with New College of Florida to come out with a report, took that report to Tallahassee, and told state senators that they were not to blame for the sentencing discrepancies, and that a university report coming out soon would show that. So what we did was we took a look at that report. We found a lot of holes in that report. We found that the report was hurried, and we found the motives behind the report to be questionable at best. So we had a story come out saying, no, actually, the report that was used by judges to influence legislation in Tallahassee was indeed flawed, and that really was the reason the bill was temporarily postponed. So we'll see what happens with this new information now if lawmakers will reconsider. But the strong pushback from judges, has led that to be stuck, at least for now.
As we wrap up, what are one or two things that you hope the reader got out of this series?
I think most readers probably, in fact, most readers have told me that they always suspected that there was racial bias in the criminal justice system and unfair sentencing, but that they were really surprised to see the numbers behind it. And so I hope it opens their eyes to the fact that this is happening. It's not just a suspicion. It really is going on. And for them to be more vocal in their support of fairness in judicial sentencing, whether that comes through legislation or whether that comes through, just the individual actions of judges when they're making decisions whether or not to accept sentencing orders or sentence recommendations that are brought before them.
And on your website, you have searchable databases.
We do.
So that if people are interested in learning more about what's going on in their area, they can go online and first read the series, the methodology you use, the databases, the 12 Circuits report, your response to the 12 Circuits report.
Correct. Yeah, and you can go on and then there's an interactive map. You can see the sentencing discrepancies in every Florida county. And actually, we've published a searchable database where you can see the sentencing discrepancies for 450 Florida trial judges. So for the first time ever, judges can actually be measured and compared on their sentencing record.
Okay, I guess before we open it up to the audience, I'm just going to ask you, are you doing any follow-ups to the series? Like, are you looking at any of the other major players in the system?
We are. The databases, especially OBTS, is massive. And there's 114 different fields. And so we've really just begun, we analyzed it one way. You could take that database and analyze it in a multitude of ways. And so we've started looking at some really interesting things that we didn't even touch upon. I'm personally really interested in bonds and people who have served time pre-trial versus people who did not serve time pre-trial and the difference that makes in their sentencing. So that's one area that I'm interested in looking at.
Yeah, so we came out with the 4-day series, and that was almost like your broad overview, and we're going to dedicate the rest of this year to looking at interesting deep dives and continue on where the story takes us and continue the discussion. One of the things we wanted to do is there's been a lot of attention in the last few years on bias at the policing level. We saw it in Baltimore, and we saw it in Ferguson, and there's been a lot of attention with videos going viral and all that with policing. We really wanted to show that it doesn't end there, and that once they enter the courtroom and the court system, that those disparities continue and oftentimes widen. And we're going to continue following that, and we're going to continue telling that story. We hope to further explore the role that prosecutors play in these disparities. We may look at like Emily said, look at some bond and bail issues, and we're going to keep telling defendant stories and just keep going down this path as long as we can.
Okay. I think we're ready for some questions.
All right. Please come to the microphone, and I will remind you this is question and answer. It's not discussion with the panelists here.
I think you touched on it several times, but I'm wondering if you actually compared the economic backgrounds of the individuals without looking at race until after. You talked about public and private lawyers, but just looking at economics alone.
Right. So there was nothing in the data that would give us an indication of how much money they made, like their income level or their profession was not included. The only measure we had was public defender versus private lawyer. And we're going to be doing a lot more of that analysis going forward.
Hi, my name is Sebas. I'm a third-year economics major here at the university. I've actually been reading this book called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander.
Great book.
Yeah, she's a law professor at the Ohio State University, and the argument the book is making is that the drug war as a whole and the way the justice system used today is in the same vein as Jim Crow and even slavery, and this is kind of a third wave of oppression of the African American community. I was wondering, based on your experience covering this story, what your opinion of that assessment is.
We read that book as well, and we were really fascinated by a lot of her ideas, and the data that we analyzed seemed to bear those ideas out. I mean, it really confirmed a lot of what she was saying. You know, I'm nowhere near her level of expertise, or I didn't go nearly as in depth as she did, but I certainly agree with her findings, at least in theory. And I mean, you could definitely look at the mass incarceration of African Americans as a continuation of slavery and Jim Crow.
And I think we tried to make that point a little bit with our lead into the series. You know, our very first lead, our very first words, we tried, we went there, what I will say is she did such a great job sort of laying out the problem, laying the groundwork for the problem, explaining how the problem happens. We wanted to put some data and numbers behind it. So that was kind of, while we might not have gotten into it as much as her in terms of explaining it and all the intricacies and all that, I think what was neat about what we did is we brought some serious data to the table that would back up these theories.
Thank you.
Is this mic working correctly? You have to talk right into it.
Yes, did you consider at all any other ethnicities other than African American and potential biases in them, and did you find any interesting results?
Sure. So the only ones that were available were Black, white, Asian, other.
Native American.
Native American. Hispanic wasn't an option because that's technically an ethnicity and not a race. So, and there really weren't that many Asians or Native Americans in the database. It was such a small number that it really couldn't measure it the same as you could African Americans and whites. That was just the vast majority of the database.
And this is just a hypothesis, but given the experts that we've talked to and the people that we've interviewed, they suspect that if Hispanics were in the database and not just generally classified as white, that the disparities would be even greater. And especially that accounts in like Miami, where you see, in many cases, whites actually get longer time. And a big part of that is because a lot of those are Hispanics. That's a heavily Hispanic area, that sort of thing. Obviously it's a more liberal area as well. But and again, in heavy Hispanic communities, you see the gaps change, but you can't really measure it because you don't know, where it lies. But certainly it influences the numbers, and we would love to dig in deeper if we could.
You said you also measured some about the political affiliations of the judges. Did you find any discrepancy there between what you viewed as Republicans, Democrats, Independents?
Right. So first I want to sort of preface this by saying, it was how they were registered to vote. So someone may be registered to vote as a Republican, but, maybe they're a Democrat trying to sabotage the election. Who knows? So we had to go by what they were registered as. We don't know what their true beliefs are. But based on their political registration, there were significant differences. It was pretty interesting. You could see that generally areas that were, you would consider more conservative areas of Florida, like the Panhandle, you saw wider discrepancies, and in areas like South Florida that are generally considered to be more liberal, they were generally more even. But on day 4, we really explored, judges are people, and like all people, the bench in Florida is a world of contradiction. We found judges, one of the most fair judges in Florida is a Republican, who sentences whites and blacks dead even through his career, which is just remarkable given the number of cases he's had. And then you'll look at judges who are liberals, and and their sentence discrepancies are just through the roof. So there are a world of contradictions but generally the pattern does sort of follow. Conservative judges tend to be tougher on crime, which translates to wider sentencing discrepancies.
In your report, you said Democratic judges are more even-handed than Republicans, black judges are more equitable than white judges, and women are fairer than men. Black women judges are the most fair, but also the toughest.
Yeah. So they'll sentence both blacks and whites to more crime. So your best bet's actually not to go before a black woman judge if you're either race.
Well, it brings up an interesting question. I mean, would you rather be treated leniently or fairly? And that's a good question. So you go before a female African-American judge, and you'll be treated fairly, but she's going to throw the book at you. So would you rather that, or would you rather go to maybe a conservative judge where there'll be more bias, but maybe there's more leniency. So it becomes a question of leniency versus fairness.
Are there any for-profit jails in Florida? Is there differences in the sentencing to these types of correctional corporate units?
We didn't look too much at corrections. It was mostly a sentencing project. So we didn't really explore too much of what happens once they enter the correction part of the system.
Are there any for-profit jails in Florida?
There are.
Thank you.
Yes.
At an event earlier today about implicit bias over in the health center, they found that providers who even seeing their results denied that it would make a difference, that it made a difference in their behavior. Some of my best friends are black, blah, blah, blah. And how do you get people, number one, to realize the bias they're manifesting and think that they ought to do something about it?
That's a good question. The judges who we spoke to, most of them were very gracious and granted us interviews even in the face of the reporting that we were doing and the numbers that we showed them, and categorically denied any overt racism. Nor do we think there's any overt racism in the judges who we interviewed. I mean, they seem to be great people. I think a lot of this is subconscious. Perhaps there are judges who, when confronted with their own numbers, will be more cognizant of it in the future. I would imagine many of them will be. Some of them perhaps will be resistant to that idea and will remain steadfast in their belief that numbers mean nothing, it's not their fault, our reporting can't be trusted. It's hard to say. I would just hope that when confronted with the data, they would at least be more cognizant, if nothing else. Even if they claim no responsibility in the bias that we saw in the numbers, that they would at least be aware that now those numbers are able to be collected and analyzed. If for no other reason they don't want to be written about again, I don't know.
Yeah, and that's been interesting. I mean, you can see a lot of that really differs by the individual. I mean, some individuals have sort of, I wouldn't say embraced it, but are more open to the idea that, hey, maybe I do have an implicit bias that I need to work on, and others have just totally rejected the notion and fought back, with every, any way they could. And actually, one of the leading opponents of our series is a judge from Sarasota, and he's the chief judge in Sarasota, and he's gone to great lengths to discredit us, and he is an African American. And we found he's actually Republican, and we found that he has one of the widest sentencing discrepancies in Florida. So while he's done, and we listed all the great things he's done for the community,
I certainly don't think that this judge intentionally set out to do that, but certainly the data supports it. Well, no, he's no longer Republican. He changed his party affiliation after we interviewed him.
I sort of want to ask a question about the databases. How accessible is it? Is it expensive? I don't know much about it. And is there different quality in the different databases that you examined?
Yeah, so it was expensive. For OPTS, which is the court database that we started off with, we had to pay $15,000 for access to that data. So it was a significant investment, and that was an investment we made not knowing if there would be a story there. You can't force a story if it's not there. So that was an investment we made just to look into this. And the data was massively complex. It was one of the most complex things we've ever done, and it was messy. So it is available. It's a public record. We want to do more things where we make it more available, access to the raw data through our project site. But given the number of records and all of that, we still haven't really figured out a way to do that.
Through Google BigQuery.
But maybe through Google BigQuery, we're going to try to do more partnerships going forward where we make the data more accessible.
But you just can't stick it up on the website because it really is mapped, 82 million records. Yeah.
In part, that was most of my question, but there was a second part to this question, which was, and my name is Ted McFetrich, and I have been involved in the court system for a long time, but no longer am I retired. The question is, are you invited to come and talk to the judges, just in a small group of judges? And if you have, would you, or if you are doing that? Because I think that may be of value for you to have this conversation that you're having today with all of us.
Yeah, actually,
with the judges on a lot of basis and in a small groups.
Right. So we have tried to interview as many judges as we can. We've reached out to a judge, and obviously we haven't talked to every judge in Florida, but we are interested in doing more of that. I know there's a Florida bar event that's going to be coming up here where I understand there's going to be some judges and stuff. We were originally slated to speak at that, but we are no longer invited.
Well, I'm not going to they've selected an author who wrote a really fantastic book on race that was nominated for a National Book Award. So they're switching track. They're instead of going with the controversial reporters who poke the hornet's nest, they're going with I believe it's a UF professor who wrote an excellent book on race, and so it's still going to be based on that. But we would be absolutely happy to meet with judges.
Absolutely. Yeah, our door has always been open.
You talked about gender when it came to judges, but did you ever consider the gender of the defendants?
You know what? I think we initially did look at that. I was not involved in the project.
We did initially, and it was kind of interesting. So there is a gender discrepancy, but it generally is not as wide as it is with race. So you would see a lot of the gender discrepancy, which again, males generally are treated more with more severity than females. But it really varies, and it'll really vary region by region. And well, we didn't have a solid enough trend to go by. But what you saw, no matter what, is that African American. I mean, the African American men always were treated the worst. Yes.
I'd like to congratulate you on this work, and as a citizen of Florida for a long time, I really appreciate that you did it. I've got not many people say that to you, because I do appreciate that you have done it. My question is, what was the trigger, what was the inspiration for this project?
So, it really was two-part. One was, oh my God, we need a project. What are we going to write about? It's a horrible feeling to have when you're sort of between projects and you feel like, I don't know what I'm going to do. So finding something and having that database there. And then also just being naturally curious. That's something that you kind of figure, I bet this is what we're going to find. But gosh, I don't know. Let's challenge ourselves. Maybe we won't find it. Maybe we'll find a completely different story. I think all of us as reporters are naturally curious about the human condition, about society, sort of modern-day anthropologists. And so when you have access to a database this robust, you can't help but be curious about what you're going to find. And certainly when we did find that our assumptions were confirmed, it really kind of stirred us, and we did read the new Jim Crow. And we just have a sense of fairness, and we want things to be fair for all citizens. And we felt like through our reporting and our writing, perhaps we had an opportunity to, if not make things fair, at least expose the unfairness.
Yeah, I think just to add to that a little bit, it really was the access to the data. An investigative reporter at the Herald-Tribune actually first obtained the OBTS data in 2011, before either of us had even gotten to the paper. Her name was Paige St. John. She actually won a Pulitzer Prize in 2011 for her work examining the insurance industry. And she was going to do a project along these lines, and she obtained the database just to sort of test judicial fairness and to gauge, whether like crimes were treated similarly. But no one ever really at the newspaper figured out a way to do it. Other projects, got placed in priority, and it just sort of sat there. And then one day we were in transition and just brainstorming ideas, and our editor said, why don't we make another run at the OBTS data and see if we can make any sense of it? Because we hadn't been able to, and we requested fresh data and got the process started, and sure enough, we were able to make sense of it. And then once we were able to do that, we knew we were on to something.
Last question then?
Too short of this. My brother is ex-law enforcement in Tallahassee, and one thing we constantly talk about, just with my major and what he's done, is this lack of distrust that he always noticed between communities, impoverished communities, especially the African American community. And so my big question is, you mentioned that these disparities don't stop with policing. They obviously take hold in the courtroom during sentencing phases. But what do you think is the first step, in your own personal opinion, to kind of starting to right these wrongs? Because it's one thing to lay out all this information, and it's a subject that I know for myself I've become fairly educated over the past year and a half. But there's so many factors that kind of play into it: education, access to resources, everything like that. And I just wondered, on a personal level, what do you think is the first step in trying to actually take action?
Well, to address the overarching issue in the criminal justice system, I don't know. But for sentencing, I do. And I think it's the reform that was filed in Tallahassee. I think the more people we've talked to, Senator Gibson has a bill that would basically just ask the state to do what we did and look at data it already has and see if they find the same disparities that we found. And that's the first step. And once they either find those disparities, which we certainly believe they will because we found them, and then they can make decisions on what to do next. But awareness, I think, is the first step.
And there's an attorney who testified at the Senate committee hearing where that bill was first introduced, who said he would love to see this data be in real time. So as a judge is ready to either sentence after a trial or perhaps accept a plea deal, he would have, or she would have, real-time data that shows exactly how other defendants have been treated, have been sentenced, and before accepting a plea deal, would be able to look and say, you know what, this isn't fair, and so be able to alter a plea deal really on the spot based on real-time information. I think that's fantastic. So yeah, for me too, the way to end sentence disparity is for the people who actually sentence to be more aware of that disparity and make decisions based on that awareness. But as far as other steps of the criminal justice process, which, yeah, really is unfair at every step of the way, I think concrete actions need to be made at those different steps of the criminal justice system. Elimination of bonds would be a great thing. Instead of setting bonds for defendants, just as a matter of practice, only set bonds for defendants who legitimately are a flight risk or pose a threat to society or to themselves. That would end huge disparities right there. Probably decriminalization of addiction, decriminalization of certain behaviors, mental illness. It just seems like we have criminalized so much these days. We've really overwhelmed the court system and are incarcerating people for things that, personally, I don't know that somebody should be in jail for being busted for the third time with a joint. But that's just me. Anything else, Jeff?
Sir, I got a big mouth, so
Well,
I
no.
don't want to get up. Funding.
First of all,
for
you have to go to the microphone.
Funding for parole officers.
Nothing's being picked up. You have to go to the
Okay.
microphone.
Funding for public defenders, funding for parole officers, funding for alternative programs, counselors, support. Looks like funds have been cut for all these things. There was an NPR interview of a public defender, and they're like, it's off the charts. How many cases we have, when you hear the actual stats for just the public defenders, you're like, well, how could there ever be any kind of fairness? Anyway, that's fine. And then the public schools, that's a whole other thing. Anyway, thank you.
Did somebody else back there have one last question? She does? All right, so this has been fascinating. You all have been great, and Josh and Emily, we so appreciate you coming up and spending this time with us. This is a really important issue. The series is well written, it's easy to read, it's chock full of information, and just getting it out and putting it on the agenda is a service to all of us, because we can't fix what we don't acknowledge, right? And so I think it's a real public service you all have done, and we very much appreciate it. Please join me in thanking our guests tonight.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
So we didn't get any questions.
No, not.
And so what was the radio?